In the last episode of this series, I asked what directions we should apply to the greater trochanter. This eminence on the femur bone has many important fascia of the upper leg and pelvis that connect to it. How do we want to manipulate this part of the leg to stretch our fascia? First, let's locate the greater trochanter. If you touch your iliac with your index finger and move an inch or two back, then move your finger 3 or 4 inches down along the outside of the leg, you will feel a bone there on the side of the leg. That is the greater trochanter. One way to answer our question is to look at what the close pack position of the hip is. The close pack position of the hip is extension, abduction, and internal rotation. Let's explore what that means. Extension is leg back and flexion is leg forward. But what does that mean in standing? Another way to think about this is that extension is when you increase the distance between the thigh and the iliacs, and decrease the distance between the thigh and the sit bones. Which means in standing, we want to lift the iliacs back and up, and move the sit bones forward. If we look at the common habitual posture of most people, we can see that flexion in standing is a closing of the distance between the front of the torso and the legs. We also see that this moves the sit bones back away from the leg. Manipulating the pelvis is absolutely key here, as the hip joint is, of course, the joining of the pelvis and the leg. Abduction of the legs is something we've looked at many times in this series. Abduction means moving the insides of the legs outwards so that the legs do not narrow. That's important to remember when we look at applying internal rotation to the femur. Internal rotation means rotating the upper leg forward and in. But this will not actually bring the legs closer together if you are abducting the legs. It's also worth noting that internal rotation at the front means external rotation at the back. These movements bring the hip into the close pack position. So what does that mean for manipulating the greater trochanter? We want to rotate it forward and in, but also make sure we are abducting the leg at the same time so that the legs do not narrow. This fits with what we've recommended so far, but there are a few things that might seem off about this. Firstly, there's the fact that we have a really crucial direction of lifting the iliacs back and up away from the side of the knee. That direction is not counter to rotating the trochanter forward. The femur and the pelvis are different bones that can be adjusted independently of each other. But for beginners, this direction for the trochanter might pose an issue. Many people are way out over the front of their feet. As we've seen before, between the drooping torso and the bent legs, people are getting very far forward. So to begin with, you need a lot of backward movement of the upper leg and the iliacs. If you're in that situation, the trochanter doesn't need to be your primary concern. But once you've started to get back behind your ankles, the antagonistic pulls between the iliacs going back and the trochanter rotating forward are a necessary step to really straightening the leg and torso. That brings us to the second thing that seems a little odd. We've seen that people have their upper leg forward. How could it be that we want to direct the trochanter, which is on the upper leg, forward? To answer this, we need to think about what is happening to the legs when the pelvis is pushed forward. And essentially everyone in the modern world presses their pelvis too far forward. When the pelvis goes forward, the legs splay. They externally rotate to make room for the drooping pelvis. Until you can get the pelvis back and up, manipulating the trochanters is not going to get you very far. But I think it can be helpful for beginners to understand the overall problem that is happening in the upper leg. Let's also think about the shape of the top of the femur. We have the greater trochanter on the outside, and the head of the femur, which fits into the hip joint, on the inside. When you push your pelvis forward, you're rotating the femur, and the head of the femur will go forward while the trochanter goes back. When you rotate the greater trochanter forward, you will push the head of the femur back into the hip socket. So while this direction seemed a little at odds with what we've seen before, it actually fits right in. But to be clear, this is a direction that is more useful for people with some experience. However, as I said, I think it's helpful to understand the totality of the problem, even if you're just at the stage of trying to rotate the iliacs back and up. By now, you should have at least a decent understanding of the common habitual problems in the legs that people experience. While of course there is variation in how these problems present, for instance, some people narrow their knees while others widen them, the root of these various problems is usually the same. So my question to you is, when someone has poor posture, what is the overall rotation that they are applying to their legs? I've listed the various problems in this series, and if you put them all together, you should see a clear spiral that people are habitually applying to their legs. We've also looked at several directions to counter this habitual splaying. Do you have a clear idea of this, or does it still seem like a lot of separate directions? Give it some thought, and then join me next episode, and we'll put together a clear conception of how to improve the use of our legs.